Hello, welcome to today's webcast entitled Roles and Functions of Queensland Integrity Agencies in Local Government. My name is Paxton Booth and I'll be your moderator today. Today's webcast is being recorded, and in the unlikely event that technical issues arise, it will be available to view later today using the same link which you accessed this webinar. Now, before we get started, I'd like to point out some of the interactive features on the webcast player you are watching right now. On the screen below, next to the timeline, you'll notice a speech bubble. That's the Ask a Question button. If you'd like to pose a question or comment at any time during the webcast, just click on the speech bubble, fill out the form, then click Send. We'll take your questions at the end of today's presentations. I encourage you to provide your name and email address along with your question or comment. That way, if we don't get to your question during the webcast, we can follow up afterwards. For any technical assistance, please email support@qld.gov.tv.com.au. Now, our first presenter this morning is Dr. Nicola Stepanov, the Queensland Integrity Commissioner. We'll be followed by Mr. Alan McSporran, Chairperson of the Crime and Corruption Commission, and then Kathleen Florian, the Independent Assessor. I'll hand over now to Nicola.
Thank you very much, Paxton, and good morning and congratulations on your election as local councillors. Welcome to our webinar today. As Paxton said, my name is Nicola Stepanov and I'm the Queensland Integrity Commissioner. So part of my role is to assist those who have been elected as councillors, and also to State Parliament to make good decisions that are in the public interest. I'm a statutory office holder and I'm an Officer of Parliament, so I'm not employed by government, and my reporting relationship is to the Speaker of the House and the Parliamentary Economics and Governance Committee. This allows for me to be impartial and independent, and you'll see that a lot with the other integrity agencies. I'm also the convener and chair of what's known as the Integrity Committee, and this includes the heads of all the agencies that you can see on the screen now, and our meeting notes are available on our website if you're interested. So I only have 4 functions under the Integrity Act. 2 relate to providing advice. I also maintain the lobbyist register, and I'm also responsible for raising public awareness about ethics and integrity issues. As well, I can be asked by the Premier to set standards. We're only a very, very tiny office, so I'm only supported by 4 staff, and it's an awful lot of business that we do. And in general, that can impact sometimes on our turnaround times for our advisors. So more than 5,000 people fall under the Integrity Act in terms of our advice function. So it includes the Premier, the Deputy Premier, the Ministers, Assistant Ministers and all other Members of Parliament. It also includes all of the statutory office holders. So you might be interested to know that there are more than 300 different government boards and bodies. As well, I provide advice to all the different commissioners and ombudsmans. Under my advice function, it includes all of the ministerial staff who advise ministers, all Directors General and Director General's equivalent, all Chief Executives, it's a very long list, all Senior Executives, Senior Officers, Senior Officer equivalents. As well, the ministers are able to nominate extra people or extra classes of persons. And this can include things like maritime pilots, the trade commissioners, extra staff within different departments, and more recently it included mayors and councillors. So if we're thinking about the ethics and advice functions of my Act, I don't provide legal advice, but I must have regard for any relevant legislation, standard or code. We have really strict secrecy provisions within our Act, and any advice I provide to someone who seeks it is non-binding. So that is, you can seek my advice, but you're not obliged to take my advice and put it into effect. However, I do recommend that you do so. There's also no right of reply for me under the Act, so I'm not able to reveal who may or may not have sought advice or what that advice might have been. Of course, any advice I provide to those who seek it must be in the public interest, so it's not in the interest of the person that's seeking the advice, and it's not uncommon that it will carry some kind of detriment to the advisee. And an example would be where they would have to sell shares, or they may have to change jobs, or they may have to step down from a role, for example, if they're a director of a company. As well, I frequently liaise with all of the other agencies, and in the local government sector that includes the Office of the Independent Assessor and the Crime and Corruption Commission. Have a look at our dashboard now. So the previous commissioners, of which I'm number 5, usually would do about 60 advices per year. Last year I received more than 394 inquiries. Again this year we're looking at a very big year, well over 200 inquiries. We've got a really growing profile in terms of the prevention space, and we do a lot of interactive education sessions, including webinars just like this, so you'd hope that I don't get tongue-tied too often because I should be used to this kind of thing. In part, this huge increase in the demand in my office is because of the heightened expectations of the public on elected officials and also senior public servants. So it's really good to see them respond by getting in and seeking advice. This is our dashboard, so it gives you a bit of a breakdown of who seeks my advice. So as you can see, at the moment about 35% of my requests are coming from the local government space, and around 30% are from members of the Legislative Assembly. As we get closer to the state election, the members of the Legislative Assembly will take up a much larger proportion of that advice. As well, you can see there that I do a lot of work with Chief Executives and Directors General and also statutory office holders. In terms of our turnaround time, as I said before, for those seeking advice, we do have a tiny office and I'm unable to delegate the advice function, so the advice is from me. So the response times vary and I prioritise any advices according to the public interest. So in general, those where there's a great public interest at stake, I will turn around on that day or within one working day. However, it can take longer than 10 days for me to be able to meet some of the advice requests that I receive, and in general it might also take up to 2 to 3 weeks, particularly for local government where you already have a lot of fantastic resources available to you. So the main areas of concern that I provide advice around about conflicts of interest, so that takes up about 80% of my workload. Of that, about 20% are what we call duty-on-duty conflicts, so this is where you might have competing duties. An example would be if you as a councillor are also the director of your own private company, and some of your obligations as a director will compete with your duties as a councillor. So that's what we call a duty-on-duty conflict. I also get asked a lot about statutory reporting obligations. For example, in the local government space, that might be about your obligations to report a suspicion or belief of a conflict of interest that involves another councillor. I also get lots of requests about the acceptance of service, gifts and hospitality, and also we do a lot of work in the post-separation obligations space. Those first three that I mentioned, of course, are all leading corruption risk factors, so that's something important to keep in mind. What we do find though is that it's entirely natural for whether you're in local government or state government or a senior public servant to have a conflict of interest occasionally, and this is because we all have people in our lives that we like or love, and we all have things that we own or memberships to particular committees, especially those community organisations. So we're trying to move away from this idea that having a conflict of interest is a negative thing. It's not. It's completely normal. What we are finding is that interest issues are becoming more and more complex, and it's really important to have the transparency around discussing the kind of interest that you have and seeking advice, including from other councillors, about how to manage that. In general, conflicts of interest for statutory office holders and people like local councillors and ministers is an underexplored area of research. So we contribute to that space, and you'll find a lot of our publications on our website. A little bit of a warning though, we do have some very long, lengthy research papers. If you are prone to insomnia, they're a good way to help you get some extra sleep. So our resources are developed in conjunction with our partners, including in the local government space with the Office of the Independent Assessor and the Crime and Corruption Commission. As well, I'd like to acknowledge Crown Law as well for their review of a lot of our resources. So the nominations of mayors and councillors is fairly recent under the Integrity Act. So Minister Hinchcliffe, in response to the Belcarra report, recommendation 28A, nominated mayors and councillors on February 5 of 2018. Previously, mayors and councillors didn't fall under my Act, and chief executives of local governments still do not fall under my Act. But we have had you now for a little bit over 2 years, and it's been wonderful to be involved with you. So if you are seeking my advice as a mayor or a councillor, you must make your request in writing, for example an email. So that's a statutory obligation, requirement that I have. I do have a lot of people trying to make contact with me via the phone, and not sending in written requests, and unfortunately I can't provide advice under those circumstances. I may ask you for more information as well once you've emailed me, just to make sure that I am aware of the full facts. And of course there are legal protections available to you if you provide me with all of the information about a conflict of interest, and I provide advice back to you and you put that advice into effect. However, it's important that I point out that if you are under investigation of any kind, including whether it's by the Crime and Corruption Commission or the Office of the Independent Assessor, it's not appropriate for you to seek my advice, and that's because we don't want to be to sort of sway the assessment or investigative process. So for mayors and councillors, you're very, very lucky in that you have a huge amount of resources available to you. So the local government department has resources available on its webpage, so does the Office of the Independent Assessor, the Crime and Corruption Commission, and also the Electoral Commission, as well as the resources that we have available on our web pages. So I would suggest that you familiarise yourself with all of those resources. Often the answers to your questions can be found in those resources. So as a first step, if you're unsure, have a look at all of the resources available to you. And you can also contact the local government department staff that are in all regional areas as well. Any other uncertainties, remember that you have the Local Government Association of Queensland, and they've got quite considerable resources on their webpage, and they also have the ability to assist you to get independent legal advice. On a final note, I always have to mention lobbying. So as I said, we regulate lobbying in Queensland and also maintain the register. Your Chief Executive will keep a record of any lobbying that occurs within your council, and if you are uncertain at any stage, if you might be being lobbied by a party and you're really not sure if they're registered or not, or if they're required to be, make sure you refer that to your Chief Executive, and they can contact our office, or they can have a look on our lobbyist register, which is publicly available. Each year I also audit the councils to make sure that they have complied with their obligations in regard to lobbying, so it's not uncommon for us to touch base on those kinds of issues. So on that note, I would just like to say once again a huge congratulations on your election success, and welcome to local government, and I look forward to meeting with you all over the next coming few years. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. That was great to hear about the roles and services that your office provides. I'm sure that a lot of councils out there will probably take you up on some of the offices services you provide. And now we'll be moving over to Alan McSpiron, the Chairperson of the Crime and Corruption Commission, with a presentation on the roles and functions of the Commission. Thanks, Alan.
Thanks, Paxton, and good morning, everyone. Just before I start my presentation, I'd like to show you a short video just to set the scene about one of our investigative outcomes.
So yeah, my name's Carl Wulff. I'm married with 2 children, grown-up children. I was the Chief Executive Officer of Ipswich City Council from July 2006 until December 2013. I held other Chief Executive Officer positions in Victoria and New South Wales. I'm now retired, and I'm speaking to you now from the Arthur Gorrie Correctional Centre, where I'm on remand waiting sentencing, which will happen next week. So I now expect to be here for some time. This has a massive effect. I don't think, I've been through a lot of things in my life, divorces and death in the family and things like that, and all of those basically pale into insignificance compared to the impact of being charged with a corruption and pervert the course of justice charge that I was back in October 2017. Everything else in your life probably pales into insignificance. The only thing I could think of that would even be comparable would be if you were told you had a terminal illness. Well, my occupation, I qualified as an engineer and undertook the roles of Chief Executive Officer for more than 10 years. I guess in my case, when this all happened, I was already retired, but If this had happened to me 20 years ago, basically my career would have been over in local government, and the chances of getting any sort of job other than some menial task, a low-paying menial task, would be pretty unrealistic. So for something like this to happen to you would really just wipe out the rest of your career. Forget what any aspirations you had for your career, and basically look for something else, but it's not going to be satisfying or as well-paying or as interesting as the career that you've given up because of stupid mistakes. It's at times like this you find out who your real friends are, and I can tell you that there aren't many. You soon find out most people who are friends, or you think are friends because of the position you hold or whatever. But I know that now I can count on one hand the people who I'd classify as still being friends. Well, financial effects are also devastating because, first of all, you've lost your job. Unlikely to get another job in any time soon, so you generally have no income. You have to engage lawyers, which is a sensible thing to do, but they're not cheap. And then things happen such as the confiscation. People come back and whatever you got in terms of corrupt monies received, they'll take that back from you. And if you don't have it, you have to find a way to get that money. In my case, I had preempted this and actually sold our home and had the money available, which I'd already put into the lawyer's trust account for that purpose, which was fortunate because the orders for confiscation resulted in the banks freezing all my accounts. So whatever money you've got in the bank, all of a sudden under the confiscation orders, your whole income stream and your whole access to funds are totally frozen, and the banks will not release that until the confiscation orders are lifted. So it's a devastating aspect that you have to sell your own home and return all the money that you've ever got from your corrupt activity. And you have no income, and in the short term you may have no access to any money that you happen to have in the bank. I think in my case, my family's always been very supportive, but I'm the oldest in the family, and my father's dead, and I'm the over power of attorney from my mother, who's 92. I've always been looked on and respected in the family as being the sort of pseudo-father figure and dependable, reliable, and all those sort of things. Even though they say that they still have, the respect for me and still hold me in esteem and that sort of thing, I'm sure that there is a significant amount of disappointment and disbelief from them that this has all happened. And to some extent, the family and the extended family are also subject to the embarrassment of the media and the publication and people asking them what's happening and what's going on. So not only do you suffer stress, but all those people around you, family and friends, also are suffering some degree of stress as a consequence. Nothing in life can prepare you for being in prison unless you've been in prison. I know one of the lawyers said to me, you'll probably be okay after a couple of weeks to get used to it. Well, I've been here now 7 weeks and I'm probably only just getting used to it now. It's a total loss of your freedom. Certainly the most, I've probably not experienced this level of anxiety on a daily basis that since I've been in prison. So every day you wake up, you're not sure what's going to happen. It's a volatile environment. There's a lot of different people with different issues. So it's certainly not somewhere that you want to ever find yourself. So sitting through many of these fraud prevention and corruption identification processes in the past, and I've sat through many of them, they're really not targeted at what really happens. They're targeted at a theory, how to put programs into place, how to tell people how to identify corruption, how to report it, what programs to put into the system to pick up double payments and all these sort of things that happen. That's fine, that's a theoretical computer-driven response to fraud and corruption. But I've never actually seen any training or any educational facility that actually relates to a real-world event where somebody is talking about their experience and how bad it is and how difficult it will be for somebody if they end up in this position. And a theoretical educational program will never come across with a heavy-hitting approach and an understanding for people to know what they could expect. And even if you think you know what you can expect, I can tell you that what actually happens is far worse than your expectations. And I'm learning it the hard way.
Well, thank you, and I hope you found that informative. Can I just commend to you that video? Not only that video, the one I've just shown you is the shortened version of the video on our website, which is easily accessible, as you know. The full video is there. It's 22 or so minutes. It goes into a lot of other aspects to Carl Wulff's background and story and the effect on him personally. So it's a very, very powerful anti-corruption prevention message, and I think it's that's one of the reasons I've shown you this before I started my presentation. So I commend it to you. It's worth looking at just to alert you to the things that can happen and the catastrophic consequences of allowing yourself to be compromised in any way. As in Carl's story, it can start with very small attempts to compromise, and once you're compromised, and no matter what method, you are forever compromised. So it's a salutary lesson. Just see if we can move the slide along. This is what I want to talk to you about today briefly. It's who we are, what we do, reporting and dealing with corrupt conduct, prevention, and finally key messages. So who we are. We've been in operation now. This is our 31st year. We were born, as you probably know, out of the landmark Fitzgerald Inquiry report in 1989. Our jurisdiction is confined to Queensland. We have a budget of about $67 million currently, which is a lot of money obviously, but for the sort of work we do, it of course is, like all of these agencies, never enough. But it's a large amount of money, as you can see. Our vision and purpose is to have safe communities supported by fair and ethical public institutions. We're an independent agency dedicated to combating major crime and reducing corruption in the sector for the benefit of the entire Queensland community. Our areas of work, we have portfolios in crime, corruption, proceeds of crime and witness protection. So our jurisdiction is widespread. We have a number, as you can see, of separate individual businesses under the banner of the CCC. Here's our objectives and areas of focus. Relevantly in the corruption space, we want to build corruption-resistant public institutions through capability development, advisory, auditing and strategic intelligence services, and of course investigate and oversee investigations into serious and systemic public sector corruption and police misconduct. And you can see our areas of focus in the current year. Relevantly, corruption involving elected officials, misuse of confidential information and exploitation of public sector resources. Those areas of focus have remained in that space roughly the same for a number of years now, and I expect will be ongoing. So who we are, our staff is roughly 360 people. It consists of multidisciplinary teams involving all of those individual disciplines. Police, we have police who are seconded to our agency. There's about 85 of them currently. They come for 3 to 5 years and then return to the police service. We also have civilian investigators, financial investigators, lawyers and those other areas of expertise. So it's a diverse workforce under the one roof. Our strategic leadership and oversight, I'm a full-time chairperson. I consist of a board that governs the commission really. I have a deputy chair who's part-time, and I have 3 part-time commissioners. We constitute the commission, which is just like a board of a company, and then we'll have a chief executive officer and heads of the other disciplines as you see on the chart. The national context is interesting because all states and now territories have an anti-corruption body, but we are the only body that also deals with organised crime. All of the other bodies are limited to corruption functions. We have also a contact with the other Commonwealth agencies. You see listed on the bottom right hand of the slide there. And in addition, we have partners around the world globally, such as the FBI, Interpol, Scotland Yard, the National Crime Agency in the UK. So we have the ability to reach out to all of those partners globally, as well as the national context you see here. So what we do, our corruption function is set out here on the slide. There's nothing terribly novel about all of that. We take very seriously not only our investigative capacity and responsibility, but also our need to upskill and educate others in the public sector, such as your sector, to help you identify, be alert to and avoid and mitigate corruption risks in your sector. Units of public administration within our jurisdiction, relevantly for you, local governments, elected officials. And you can see that our jurisdiction is very widespread and goes right across the public sector, including courts, tribunals and boards. We have special powers, quite extraordinary powers really, coercive hearings, telephone interception and access warrants, search warrants and surveillance device warrants. Those powers, I can assure you, extraordinary though they are, they're taken extremely seriously by us. They're not routinely granted. We have to justify the use of them, and our use of them is monitored regularly, not just by our oversight committee, but by the agent of that committee, being the Parliamentary Commissioner, who audits and monitors our use of those extraordinary powers routinely. The last thing we would want is to do something improper or inappropriate in relation to those powers and risk losing them, because they are, as it turns out, I can assure you, our most important and productive investigative tools. This is a bit of a snapshot of our work. It relates to the July 18 to June 19, so it's slightly out of date now, but it's reflective generally of the sort of scope of our work. The number of complaints we have, you see the number of assessed complaints is higher because it's an ongoing process of assessing complaints that have come in the previous period. The corruption investigations there on the middle box on the left, our crime investigations, our witness protection function, which is extremely important for obvious reasons. We haven't yet lost a customer, I'm proud to say. Our proceeds of crime function, we take the money from criminals and that's forfeited to the state, becomes part of consolidated revenue. At the bottom there you see our hearings. There were 244 days of hearings and 3 days of public hearings. That, as I say, is a very important part of our investigative capability. And in our prevention space, we've produced 5 audit reports and 82 prevention recommendations. So it's a busy area. Belcarra you're aware of. I'll encourage you to read that report. It started out as after complaints from the 2016 election into those practices undertaken by candidates for those councils, Gold Coast, Ipswich, Moreton Bay and Logan. The allegation types are there. We've made a public report which had 31 recommendations which were accepted virtually totally by the government to their credit and led to widespread reform, which is ongoing, I'm pleased to say, and is going further than even the recommendations we made from Belcarra. So it's widespread reform that's been welcomed across the sector and has hopefully made your jobs as newly and ongoing elected officials a little easier by way of guidance and direction. Out of Belcarra came some landmark investigations at Ipswich, particularly Logan, Gold Coast and Moreton Bay, and also some of the Indigenous councils. Regrettably, but necessarily, there have been a range of criminal charges laid out of those investigations. Ipswich, of course, as you've seen, involved Carl Wulff, 2 mayors, another CEO and so on. Many of those matters are still currently before the court, as they are in respect of the Logan and Moreton Bay and Palm Island regional councils. The Gold Coast Council, we published a public report, Operation Yabba, which gave some stark reminders about unsatisfactory practices that were engaged in by that council, and the management, I should say, of that council. So I encourage you to read those reports where they exist, particularly the Ipswich and Gold Coast Council reports, which are meant to be another way to educate and alert you to some of the pitfalls and dangers that need to be addressed in the corruption prevention space. So, tell you something about reporting and dealing with corrupt conduct. Corrupt conduct is defined in section 15 of our Act. It's set out there. Frankly, it's a fairly complex definition. Even our lawyers who've dealt with it for years would not say for a moment it's simple and easily understood. Subsection 2 of the definition goes on to outline and extend our jurisdiction somewhat to allow it to take care of people who are not public officials themselves, but through their conduct seek to influence public officials. That's a necessary extension because, as you know, with the increasing numbers of public and private partnerships, there's a lot of work done to influence the work that you do from outside your sector, and you have to necessarily deal with that from time to time. So the definition is meant to cover all of those things, and hopefully it does. Here's how we deal with complaints. Essentially, when a complaint comes in, it's assessed. We might assess it as being able to be referred back to the agency to be investigated or dealt with, subject to our monitoring in various levels or an audit later by us of how it's been handled. If we decide that it's serious enough under our Act to investigate ourselves and we retain the investigation, that might result in us laying criminal charges, or it might result in us referring evidence gathered back to the agency, including the Commissioner of Police or the Mayor or CEO of your council, to deal with internally by way of disciplinary action. Or it may be referred by us ultimately to QCAT, the Queensland Civil Administrative Tribunal, if we're not happy with the way it's been dealt with internally. So that's how generally we deal with complaints that come in. It's a mandated, orderly process, and we try to keep complainants informed as to how that process is progressing. We have a guide called Corruption in Focus. It's designed to assist you in understanding our jurisdiction and how you should deal with complaints that come to you, and whether what the test is for you to refer complaints that come to you to be referred on to us. That deals with some of the complexities I've referred to in our definition, and as I say, is designed to help you understand how to process these things and to give you some significant guidance. So I commend that to you. It's on our website. It's easily downloaded or looked at online. So go to our website and take the time to look at what we've got there to assist you in this important work you may have to do in the future. Prevention, can I say something about prevention? In my view, prevention is our most critically important function. It's no longer sustainable in the long term to simply continue to enforce the law, although that's necessary. Even police services around the world have come to understand that enforcement is not the answer. You have to get ahead of the game and prevent or disrupt at least, rather than rely on enforcement as the go-to position. So prevention is critically important. You need to understand how to recognise risks, how to get ahead of the game and put in place measures in your policies and procedures and your workshops with your staff to have them understand how to prevent corruption getting out of control. And that's the advantage of things like the Wulff video, which give a very real, practical example of the things that can arise. This series of resources available on our website, I again commend highly to you. They're designed to help you. They cover the range of things, as you can see there. Our Prevention in Focus series, our Fraud and Corruption Control Best Practice Guide, our advisories, case studies and reports, and our joint agency communiques. They're all designed to assist you understand your jurisdiction and deal with the myriad of problems you're going to face in your important work over the next 4 years of your term. So prevention, take it seriously, make sure your staff take it seriously and get on top of it and work to prevent things getting out of control before they become a messy problem that you may have to deal with and suffer the inevitable reputational damage that comes with it. So what are the key messages? There are the common allegations that are made in this area. Can I particularly alert you to, as Nicola has, to the problem with conflicts of interest. That is, in our experience, the single most important thing you need to understand. There is nothing wrong with having a conflict of interest. It's quite normal, as Nicola has said. The problem is not declaring it and managing it. I mean, take for instance a remote council where some of you are stationed. It is very difficult not to do your work without having conflicts of interest. You might be a mayor, an elected official as part of a committee giving a roadworks contract. The roadwork contractor, one of whom has tendered for the job, is your uncle. It might be your brother, your father, or certainly a very close friend. They might be a preferred tenderer because they've got experience in the job, they've got the cheapest price, they're the only one that has the relevant machinery. Common sense would dictate they should have the contract. But that whole process could go completely off the rails if you didn't declare the fact that they are a relative of yours and that you should stand back from making the decision, or at least declare the conflict and say it's managed by making sure that relationship has nothing to do with the awarding of the contract. The contract is awarded for documented, sensible commercial reasons. They've got the experience, they're the cheapest price, they're the most able to do the work with the machinery they've got. So all of those reasons, if someone queries how your brother got the contract, you can say, here are the commercially documented, sensible reasons how they got it. And not because they're my brother, or father or uncle, but because they're the best suited and able to do the contract. It's a simple method to just tune your thinking to, rather than say, I know I've done nothing wrong so I don't have to declare this conflict, to what if someone who didn't know me would think about the contract being awarded to my brother? Would they think that was potentially corrupt? Well, of course they would. So they need to be told in a documented, transparent fashion that the fact that they're related to you had nothing to do with your relationship. It's for good commercial reasons. It's your best defence. Think carefully about it. Transparency and accountability is the answer. So be upfront about these things. If in doubt, disclose it and get some advice and help from your co-committee members, your co-staff, and work through it in a careful, sensible, respectful way. And you can't get into trouble if you do that. So finally, here's a message from the Electoral Commission of Queensland. Because you've just been elected or re-elected, remember the due date of 13 July this year, and those things have to be in place. So take the time to understand that, as I'm sure you do. Don't miss the deadline because, as you'll see there, you risk automatically vacating office if you fail to lodge a return by that due date. So, and if you have any problem with it, you're unsure, there's the number to be in contact with the Funding Disclosure and Compliance Unit at the ECQ. So they're there to help you as much as we are. So take the time to get on board and make sure you do the right thing for yourself and your council. So thanks very much for your attention. I hope it's been helpful to you. Just continually bear in mind that we're here to help you. Although we carry a big stick and need to enforce the regulations and laws necessarily, our very critically important function is to help you do your important work for the community of Queensland. So again, thank you and congratulations and all the best for the future. I'll hand over now to Kath Florian, or Paxton wants to say a few words first, I think.
Thanks, Alan. Some great information and insights there about the Crime and Corruption Commission roles and functions. I'll just remind our audience that we are taking questions at the end of Kath's presentation. Good to see a few questions have already come through. That's terrific. Now, there is a bit of a delay between what we're when we're talking to you and us receiving the questions. So please, if you've got any questions, start sending those through now so we can get ready for the questions after Kathleen, and that would be great. Now, I'll hand over to Kathleen Florian to tell us about her role in this as the independent assessor. Thanks, Kathleen.
Good morning, everyone. So the Office of the Independent Assessor was established in December of 2018, and whilst the Crime and Corruption Commission looks at the criminal side of things, as it were, the focus of the Office of the Independent Assessor is on disciplinary matters and on building capacity of councillors. So we see ourselves as, I suppose, what stands between councillors and the Crime and Corruption Commission, and if we do our job as best we can, then what we're doing is assisting councillors not to get to a point where they end up with matters before the Crime and Corruption Commission, and that's really about two things. That's about helping to build the capacity of councillors, and I'm going to talk more about that shortly, but also about dealing with disciplinary matters or misconduct matters, and dealing with those matters in a way which is independent of any local government politics and which is consistent and appropriate, so that there is a sort of strong, consistent message about standards that are being followed up on a regular basis. And if we think that if we can do those two things well, working with local government, then the hope is that we will reduce the number of matters that are considered by the Crime and Corruption Commission. So I want to talk first about what is the conduct that exists within the local government area. So there are three categories of conduct that the OIA may have some engagement with. The first is inappropriate conduct. Inappropriate conduct is either a breach of a local government policy or a breach of the code of conduct. Misconduct is more the OIA's bread and butter, and while inappropriate conduct and misconduct are referred to the Office of the Independent Assessor for assessment, inappropriate conduct is referred back to local government for investigation, and misconduct is investigated by the Office of the Independent Assessor. If we've received matters that raise a reasonable suspicion of corrupt conduct, then we have a statutory obligation to refer those matters to the Crime and Corruption Commission, and on some occasions they may be referred back to us to undertake investigations. So they're the three categories of conduct that we most commonly see. Now, the Office of the Independent Assessor receives complaints, and we try and channel all complaints that we receive through our complaints form online. And the reason why we channel it through our complaints form is for two reasons. Firstly, it ensures that we identify complaints that aren't really appropriate for the Office of the Independent Assessor, that don't relate to our jurisdiction. So complaints about council employees that are outside our jurisdiction, about candidates, or about council decisions, because we look at councillor conduct, not councillor decisions. So we are seeking to identify those sorts of complaints that are really not relevant to us and to redirect them to the appropriate agency rather than them continue through the councillor complaints process. The next reason why we try and push things through our online form is that the form prompts people to provide the information that we really need to be able to assess matters quickly and robustly. So we will be seeking, we'll give you examples of complaints and the level of detail which is good for us to be able to assess them properly. And we will also ask for prompts around whether there are any witnesses that are identified or documents that are relevant. Once we receive a complaint, we undertake to try and have that matter assessed, an outcome, and that outcome communicated within 21 working days. And about 81% of our matters are assessed within that time frame. The inappropriate conduct matters tend to go over that time frame, and I'll speak in a little while why that's the case. In terms of the outcome of our assessment process, there are essentially 5 different outcomes that can flow from that assessment process. A matter could be referred to the CCC if it raises a reasonable suspicion of corrupt conduct. A matter may be investigated by the OIA if it raises a reasonable suspicion, I suppose, of misconduct. A matter may be referred to local government if it falls within the category potentially of inappropriate conduct. But for inappropriate conduct, there is a process under the Act where we will serve on or provide a councillor a Section 150 AA notice which sets out the allegation of inappropriate conduct and provide councillors with an opportunity to respond both to that allegation and to the issue about whether it should be referred back to local government for investigation. The practical effect of that is that it also often becomes a bit of a mini investigation in itself, and it allows us to identify matters where it's not appropriate to refer back to local government. But the process of going through that can take some time, and it tends to be those inappropriate conduct matters which exceed the 21 days. Alternatively, matters can either be dismissed under Section 150X or no further action taken under Section 150Y, and which we use depends really on who the source of the complaint is. Complaints from the members of the public are dismissed under Section 150X, and complaints from all other sources under Section 150Y. And the sorts of reasons why complaints may be dismissed or no further action taken is because it doesn't raise a reasonable suspicion of inappropriate conduct or misconduct, that it may be that it's lacking in substance, it may be that it's vexatious or not in good faith, it may be that it's not in the public interest or a justifiable use of resources. So that's the assessment process. So when the OIA receives a complaint, all complaints go through that assessment process. Now, I want to talk to you about vexatious, frivolous and not in good faith complaints, because I know that this is an issue of concern to many councillors. The OIA has a 3-step escalation process to deal with complainants and complaints that are frivolous, vexatious and otherwise improper. But it is recognised that there may be occasions where a complainant's behaviour is so serious that the OIA will move directly to step 3. Under the Local Government Act, and by virtue of that the City of Brisbane Act, the OIA can both dismiss a matter because it's vexatious or not in good faith, but in appropriate circumstances it can also charge a person with making a complaint that is vexatious or not in good faith. So to manage that process, we've put in place this 3-step escalation process, and the first step is if we receive a complaint that we believe is sort of borderline improper complaint, then we will dismiss the complaint as lacking in substance But when we write back to the complainant, we'll say that we think this is a borderline vexatious complaint, and please be aware that we can dismiss complaints on that basis, and it's also an offence to make such a complaint. If that complainant continues to make a complaints which are vexatious or not in good faith, then the next step is that we will dismiss the complaint as vexatious or not in good faith, and that we will then warn that complainant that if they make another complaint that falls into the same category, then they will commit an offence, and we give them the details of that offence and the penalties that apply. To date, that escalation process has been successful in stopping all but one complainant at that point. There are, in all local government areas, motivated complainants, and I think it's important to make the point that we will not consider a complainant as vexatious if their complaint has substance. And so motivated complainants, I know, are a challenge for all local government councillors, but I would encourage local government councillors to focus not on motivated complainants, but on your own conduct, because that is your best line of defence in dealing with motivated complainants, to ensure that in your conduct you don't expose yourself in any way. I want to talk now more about what exactly is misconduct. So misconduct can be a breach of the trust which is placed in a councillor. So what is a breach of trust? A breach of trust is where you link a breach to either a breach of the local government principles or to one of the local council responsibilities. So if there are 3 documents that I would recommend that each councillor keeps close by them, it is the Code of Conduct, it is the local government principles, which are duplicated in the Code of Conduct but are in Section 4 of both the City of Brisbane Act and the Local Government Act, and the councillor responsibilities, which are in Section 12 and 14 of each of those acts. And if there are times where during your career you've got difficult decisions before you and you're under pressure, have regard to those documents, because they're really going to be good documents to help keep you on track. The role of a local government councillor is really akin to a member of the board and a director on a board of directors, and it's a very strategic role. It's not an operational role. The role of local government councillors is to set the policy and to make the decisions that are made before councils. And there are 2 heads of potential misconduct, which really are about ensuring that local government councillors are focused on that more strategic and not operational role. And those are the misconduct provision which makes it misconduct for a local government councillor to direct a local government employee or to make a request which is not consistent with the acceptable request guidelines of council. So all councils have to resolve to have acceptable request guidelines. So as new councillors, I'd encourage you to familiarise yourself with what is the acceptable and appropriate way to deal, as you must, with local government employees in undertaking the really important work that you do. The other categories of misconduct there relate to the misuse of council information or the publication of information which is confidential. I'd recommend to you in the LGAQ Councillor Handbook, in the schedule, there's an excellent list of matters which could be considered confidential to council. But as a rule of thumb, if you have information and it's not publicly known, then think carefully about whether that's information which you should share with the broader public on social media or through a media interview. But at the bottom of there's a series of conduct which are not classified as misconduct under the Local Government Act, but which are statutory offences. And these include failing to disclose a conflict of interest, failing to disclose a material personal interest, a councillor with one of those interests influencing or attempting to influence another councillor or a council employee, and not complying with the requirements around registers of interest. These are matters which can be dealt with as a statutory offence, but the approach of the OIA has been to deal with all of these matters as disciplinary matters in the first instance. And there are really three situations where we would look at dealing with these matters as a statutory offence. And they are where the conduct is so serious that it immediately escalates to that. And an example may be a failing to disclose a material personal interest in circumstances where you will receive a substantial benefit from the decision of council that you're participating in. We will also view a matter seriously if there is any sort of form of reprisal action taken either against another councillor or a local government employee. That's a really important aspect that we must enforce strongly. And the third situation is where we have tried to deal with matters on a disciplinary basis on a number of occasions, and our attempts to do that haven't been successful in getting the councillor to look at dealing with that matter in a different way. So in those circumstances, like the vexatious approach, that calls for an escalated response in that situation. So they're the main categories of misconduct, or the sorts of matters that we will deal with on a disciplinary basis. Now, the disciplinary approach is not intended to be punitive. A lot of the outcomes of disciplinary matters are about counselling, about training, about doing things which assist counsellors not to go down that path again. So although it can have a deterrent aspect, the idea of misconduct matters is to really get counsellors on the right track. If the OIA commences an investigation, we will send a letter of this type that provides you with two options. The letter will set out the full allegations, and including all the particulars, and will give you an option of either identifying that the allegation is correct, in which case we can fast track that matter to the Councillor Conduct Tribunal as soon as possible, and we'll engage with you to come up with a agreed statement of facts to do that. If that happens, you can expect that the Councillor Conduct Tribunal will be taking into account your self-awareness and your cooperation in determining if and what sanctions should be applied. Alternatively, if you look at an allegation and you don't agree with it and it's not correct, then we'd ask you to let us know, and then we'll conduct a full investigation into that matter. After an investigation is conducted, all those same options on assessment continue to be available. So if it turns out to be more serious, it can be referred to the Crime and Corruption Commission. If it turns out to be less serious, it can be referred to local government or dismissed, or no further action taken. And that's a great outcome from an investigation as well, because if we make a decision to dismiss or to take no further action, then we provide really detailed reasons to both the complainants and to the councillors, so that some of these things that can hang around for long periods of time can be put to bed. If, however, at the end of that investigation process there is a reasonable satisfaction that misconduct has occurred, then we will commence a natural justice process to ensure that a councillor has all the information arising from the investigation and the opportunity to consider that and provide any other information or reasons why that matter should not be referred to the Councillor Conduct Tribunal, and a decision will not be made about whether that gets referred until those submissions are taken into account. We've announced an amnesty for all first-time councillors, so councillors who have no previous experience of local government, which will go up until the 5th of August. unless a matter is serious. And the idea of the amnesty is that it's about capacity building for first-time councillors while you get your feet under the table, and taking into account also the current COVID environment. Doesn't mean that we'll be ignoring complaints, however. We'll be communicating with those councillors to help them understand their legal obligations and the standards expected of elected representatives. So it's just a step to help build capacity, while you're sort of acclimatising to this new environment. This is a bit of a data dashboard about the work of the OIA since we've commenced on the 3rd of December 2018. Currently there are 211 active investigations. There are 30 matters that are currently with our legal team undergoing that natural justice process, 30 matters currently before the Councillor Conduct Tribunal, and 36 matters have gone through the other end, and 1,100 matters have been dismissed or no further action taken, either after assessment or after a full investigation of the matter. So, as Alan said previously, that prevention is a really important aspect of what we do, and building a councillor's capacity to deal with the challenging circumstances of leadership in a local government environment and as elected representatives is critical. Previously, the Councillor Conduct Tribunal decisions have not been visible to councillors, and that's a really important aspect of getting that feedback loop to councillors about how the Councillor Conduct Tribunal is applying the standards, so that councillors can see that and apply it to their own circumstances, and to assist with the decision making around conflicts of interest which occur at council. Because conflicts of interest are such a significant issue, we worked with the Integrity Commissioner earlier in the piece to develop a range of meeting aids and tools to assist councillors to not only understand when they have a material personal interest or a conflict of interest, but to assist councils to develop their capacity as a council to identify whether there is a conflict of interest, and if there is, how is the best way to manage that interest in the public interest, so that that is all transparent and upfront and recorded on the record, so that people who are watching the live stream or in the back of the council room can see that as a local government you are really cognizant of your interests. They're out there, but you're dealing with them in the public interest, and that may mean that a councillor on occasion should be staying in the room, but if that's the case, then that needs to be recorded why that's occurring. Social media is also a critical issue for councillors, so we've worked with the Local Government Association to develop social media guidelines for councillors to help you manage your virtual presence, to ensure that you don't breach the code of conduct or misconduct, and that you navigate what can be really difficult waters in terms of the unacceptable behaviours sometimes of members of the community when they're engaged on social media, and that you don't become a part of that either. And registers of interest, there are also resources on our website to assist you with registers of interest. So these are some of the products that we have put out. Most recently, an advice on the use of messaging applications, which we've put out in collaboration with the Queensland State Archives. We'd encourage you to follow the OIA on tweets, and you'll receive a lot of the stuff that we push out in real time. And finally, I want to talk about what you can proactively do now to ensure that there are not misconduct issues, and certainly that you don't ever go anywhere near the Crime and Corruption Commission, no offence. The first thing is that I'd really encourage you to take this time now to understand your conflicts of interest. If you have recently received donations and they're from a person, do you know what companies are associated with that person? If you've received a donation from a company, do you know what individuals are associated with that company? Is it practical for councillors to have to do that every time they get a meeting agenda? No, I don't think it is. But it is practical and proactive to do that now at the commencement of your term, and it's probably appropriate to do that probably 18 months in as well. So if you have a business, consider now how you're going to identify any overlap between your business and council. If you have a number of people who are very close to you or relatives who do business with council, consider now how is the best way to deal with that. So I'd encourage you to take some time now to think about that, because I've noticed that when matters go before the Councillor Conduct Tribunal, one of the first things that they want to know is what methodology have councillors put in place to be able to identify and check their conflicts of interest. Make sure that your registers of interest are locked and loaded, because we're now at a time when those registers of interest are due. If you overlook something, update it as soon as possible, and remember that as your interests change, you have 30 days in which to update your registers of interest. Have that code of conduct, the local government principles and section 12 or 14 if you're in the Brisbane City Council nearby to you, and use it as your reference point where you have to make tough decisions. Review your social media guide to inform your social media presence and management. And I'd really encourage you to follow the OIA and the CCC on Twitter, and probably yours too, Nicola, for the Integrity Commission's Twitter, to get regular updates about matters that are pushed out, which are there to try and assist you to build capacity. So that brings us to the end of my presentation from the Office of the Independent Assessor. Whilst our staff are all relatively new, in addition to selecting staff because they're really good at what they do, I really wanted to make sure we selected staff who were really easy to engage with and decent people. So if you have any questions and if you have any concerns at any time, then I'd really encourage you to get on the phone to us and to contact us, and we spend many hours talking things through with councillors and with complainants, and we'd encourage you to do that.
Thanks, Kath. Some very useful and interesting information about the roles and functions of your office. I'm sure, particularly for our new councillors out there, will have found that very, very useful for them in their new role. Now we're moving over to open up for questions and comments. Just a reminder to everyone to click on the speech bubble below at the bottom of the screen to also provide your name and email address. So just in case we don't get to your question today, we can certainly get a response to you after the webinar has finished. We've got a few questions that have come in already, which I'll throw to in a moment. But just a reminder, there's a bit of a delay between you typing in your questions and us receiving them, so don't leave it till the end. If you'd like to start doing that now, that would be great. We'll start off with the first question that's come in, which is for Alan. The question, Alan, is why do you want to remove the requirement for dishonest intent? Considering people make honest mistakes all the time, why are you continuing to consider this?
Well, the main reason is that you don't need to have as an element of a new offence that there is a dishonest intent required to be proved. As we said in our submission, and as I said in evidence before the committee, the law currently provides in offences of fraud and misconduct in public office that intent. So the law already caters for that offence. And if it's serious enough for a dishonest intent to be proved, it becomes either fraud or misconduct in public office. We're not trying to penalise people who make honest mistakes, because people do, as you say, in that very sensible question. But we don't propose there be an absolute offence. We propose a strict liability offence. And the difference for lawyers, I can tell you, is that it does allow reasonable excuses to be taken into account and so forth, quite apart from the discretion that the prosecutor would have as to whether they proceed at all if the evidence was that someone simply overlooked an obligation. The idea of making it a new offence is to heighten the awareness of all elected officials in particular to their need to update their register of interest and declare conflicts of interest. And the failure to do so in the face of it being an offence under the criminal law makes it much easier to prove that there is a nefarious intent behind the failure to declare such a conflict. It's all about evidentiary facilitation, if you like, to make it more user-friendly and easier to prove.
Thanks, Alan. Next one for Nicola. Nicola, you spoke during your presentation about the functions of your office in providing advices to a number of different people, including our councillors in public office now. What's the typical turnaround time at the moment that councillors should expect if they are asking for advice from your office?
Oh, that's a very good question. So as I said, we have more than 5,000 people under the Act. So on any given day, I can receive as many as 20 different advices that I have to prioritise. Unfortunately, I'm not able to delegate the advice function. So the advices are written by me, from me to you, and that can mean that there will be a significant lineup in front of you. So at the moment for local councillors, it's taking in excess of 2 to 3 weeks. If I receive more urgent matters that need to be attended to, that also will sort of set back a particular advice as well. So I would encourage you in the first instance to make yourselves familiar with all of the materials that you have available to you on all the different websites, and then also reach out to LGAQ and the local government department, any policy officers within your particular regions for just as a first step.
Thanks, Nicola. Kath, so one of the questions we've got from your presentation is in relation to vexatious complaints. And the question is, has there been any charges laid against vexatious complaints thus far?
Okay, so as I explained, we put in place this 3-step escalation process. As a result of that process, we have had only one person go past step 2 in that escalation process. That person was the subject of a criminal investigation and was criminally interviewed, but based on medical reasons, a charge was not preferred on that matter.
Thanks.
Can I just add, in supplementing that comment, there's a very fine line, I think, between punishing, as it were, by charging someone who is potentially a vexatious complainant, and destroying the faith that someone's shown in making a complaint and trying to bring to light what they believe, often wrongly, uninformed, cases of misconduct. We've taken the view at the CCC that it's far better that we get a higher workload of complaints that go nowhere, because it's a very serious step to take to do anything to discourage complainants. Our experience has been that 99.9% of complainants are genuine, although a large percentage are uninformed or misinformed, but they're bona fide. We shouldn't be discouraging them. There's a very small minority who are vexatious and make deliberately false complaints, and they should be dealt with. But it's very hard to prove, and there's very few of them.
Thanks, Alan. I suppose a follow-up question for myself in that regard. Kath, you spoke about, or used the term, motivated complainants that sometimes come across your desk in the context of vexatious complaints. And obviously some decisions made by councils, while having a positive impact on the community in general, can have an adverse impact on other members of the community who may feel that their voice has not been heard during the decision-making process. What advice do any of you have for councillors to avoid allegations of corruption or misconduct being made following the making of these difficult decisions?
Well, the making of difficult decisions, I suppose, is the role and responsibility of councillors, and more than any other level of government in Australia, councillors are making high-value, high-frequency decisions on every time you go into a council meeting. And I think that's why it's really important that council meetings are as transparent as possible, and how decisions are made in council meetings are as transparent as possible. Including obviously when there may be some interest, which is perfectly natural in small communities, by councillors in how a decision is made. So I think doing everything that you can as a council to be as transparent in decision making and clear in your decision making process, it goes a long way. There will obviously, we all know, there will be people who will be aggrieved by decisions. From the OIA's perspective, a grievance with a council decision does not come within our jurisdiction. So a lot of our focus in receiving complaints is about identifying people whose concern is not so much about councillor conduct, but a decision of council, and redirecting those matters to the Ombudsman's office, which is the more appropriate course.
Thanks, Kath.
I think I'd just add, I agree entirely with what Kath said. I think transparency is the key. People will not necessarily agree with you in making a decision that's often difficult and does reflect badly on some people or doesn't have the right outcome for them, but they will always, or should always, respect if they can understand how you arrived at the decision. If they can't understand how you arrived at the decision, they are very prepared to, understandably, speculate that there's been a nefarious motive behind it. So transparency is the key, always.
Thanks. Another question for you, Kath. From a previous slide in your presentation, it said there had been over 1,700 complaints, yet only 36 decisions. Are the dismissed complaints able to be reassessed?
Okay, so there are 36 matters that have gone through the Councillor Conduct Tribunal and come out the other side. There are roughly a similar amount that are currently before the Councillor Conduct Tribunal, and roughly a similar amount that are currently being prepared for referral to the Councillor Conduct Tribunal. Under the Act, we can dismiss or take no further action on a matter either at assessment or after a full investigation has taken place. If we dismiss after a full investigation, we provide really detailed reasons for that. If we dismiss on assessment, then we're obviously dismissing based on a more preliminary view of the matter, and A, whether it comes within our jurisdiction, and B, whether there's really sufficient there to raise a reasonable suspicion, or whether there are reasonable inquiries that could be undertaken in relation to that matter to be able to get to the bottom of it. If a matter is dismissed after assessment, there is a review process. So the standards for, best practice standards for complaint agencies require a review capability, and we have that policy on our website. I've conducted every review myself. There's been about 77 of them, and in those cases they were matters that were dismissed where complainants were unsatisfied with that outcome. So I have reviewed those matters not just as a matter of process, but as a matter of merit and content. And in about 3 or 4 matters I've overturned the assessment decision and said that an investigation is appropriate. So yes, there is a review process.
All right. Thanks, Kath. Nicola, a question for you in relation to, I suppose, managing conflicts of interest. Regional councils are often faced with unique issues or challenges in relation to managing conflicts of interest in small communities. They're generally not seen in our larger councils. What advice would you give to councillors as to how they can ensure that these conflicts of interest are managed well?
Oh, look, we experience the same kind of things with the boards. So a lot of our hospital and health boards are remotely or regionally located, as are other boards. In the materials that we've prepared with the Office of the Independent Assessor, there are some simple one-page guides for councillors who may have a conflict or may have an interest and they're unsure about what to do about it. How they should approach the matter, including what they should be disclosing to council in relation to the interest. And then in those little one-page meeting aids, it's also a list of questions that council can run through and put to the councillor who has the particular interest for council to then reach a decision about whether it would give rise to an actual or a perceived conflicts of interest under the Local Government Act. So we do have some really simple one-page guides. Prior to COVID, we were also doing some workshops with councils through last year, so that was really enjoyable. We were spending an hour and a half with council, so Kath and I would travel together and run through some hypothetical scenarios. So hopefully we might be able to get that started post-COVID. It would probably be a bit dull to do over a virtual meeting. It wouldn't have the same impact, I don't think. But there are lots of aids available, and in the if you are unsure, we would always encourage you to declare a personal interest before council and then use those meeting aids for council to decide whether it would give rise to a conflict of interest.
Thanks, Nicole. That's great.
Could I add that I'd really encourage councillors to get proactive and on the front foot with their conflicts of interest, to reflect now on what are the sorts of matters where you think you're going to have an overlap with council business, and to think in advance of how you can identify those matters and how you're going to manage those matters when they come up, rather than, I suppose, be in the situation where you're looking at an agenda item and meeting papers and seeing an issue that comes up days before the meeting is about to commence. So to really think through those issues now, get advice and put things in place so then you're really alert to it. And if there's ever any issues, you can demonstrate, if you make a record of that, that you've taken a really proactive approach and you've thought things through.
Thanks, Kath. Just a reminder to our audience, we're getting close to our time, so if you've got any final questions you'd like to send through to the head of the integrity agencies, get them through to us now. For now, I suppose a follow-up question, Kath, in relation to your presentation. You spoke about, or you mentioned the amnesty period you've got for new councillors and that the cut-off date is the 5th of August. Is there any leeway with that date? Is there any kind of flexibility in the date for new councils, or what should they take away from that?
Well, I guess there's already some leeway in the start time, but it is strictly the 5th of August. But bear in mind that we do take into account, and the Councillor Conduct Tribunal also takes into account, if misconduct has been engaged in by a new councillor or someone who's not as experienced. So we certainly, moving forward, do take that on board, and you're not going to be thrown in the deep end. A big part of the disciplinary process is about building capacity for you to be able to manage your important work as a councillor without there being issues moving forward.
All right, thanks, Kath. This one's headed constant complaints. What can we do with regards to multiple complainants raising the same issue concerns and re-prosecuting the same points? At what point does it become frivolous or vexatious?
Okay, I think I can address that, and that's where we find our escalation process very useful. There are some complainants who I have described as motivated complainants who are aggrieved by particular councils or council decisions, and who you can see a pattern of making regular complaints. As Alan says, in many cases those people have genuine concerns and grievances, and they genuinely believe in what it is that they're complaining about. But we need to manage the complaints process in a way that's balanced. That is about making sure that people who have genuine complaints are heard and that those matters are addressed and dealt with. But it's also about dealing with complaints in a way where they're finalised. If it's appropriate after an investigation to dismiss a matter, and providing detailed reasons for that. And it's about having consequences for unacceptable complainant behaviour as well.
Thanks, Kath. I know the Crime and Corruption Commission faces the same challenges with multiple complaints coming in about similar issues. Alan, is there anything you want to add?
Thanks, Paxton. We do. It's unfortunately a problem for all integrity agencies. Even the best intentioned complainants sometimes have it totally wrong and won't understand, even if it's explained to them fairly carefully and transparently, that they're on the wrong path or they're misinformed. They usually add us to the level of conspirators against them. And what normally happens to us is we say eventually, we run out of patience and say, look, you've given us nothing new. This is the same old complaint you've made over the last 3 years. We won't any longer engage in correspondence with you, and that's the end of it. and the correspondence is marked accordingly. What we normally find then is they go to our oversight committee and complain about that fact. Then the oversight committee comes to us and asks us to please explain our conduct with that complainant, and wastes more of our time. But that's just the process. It comes with our territory, we accept that, but I can assure you it's an ongoing huge demand upon limited resources. So people are, well-intentioned though they are, some people are very difficult to get through to that their complaint is ill-founded, uninformed or misinformed.
Thanks, Al.
Can I just say that I think that where councillors are the subject of a motivated complainant, it can be obviously a really distressing situation, and a natural reaction to that can be to become very focused on those complainants or that association or whatever it may be. But in what I've seen and in my experience as the independent assessor over the last 18 months, I think a much more positive way to expend your energy and proactive way, and probably better for your mental health, is to just focus on your own conduct and make sure that there are no vulnerabilities there, rather than focused on those motivated people. And as best as possible, I would ask you to trust that the process that we have for dealing with escalating vexatious or improper complaints will address it.
Thanks, Kath. A question for Nicola about lobbyists. Could you outline any changes to the persons who would qualify as lobbyists, please? My understanding has always been if the person is an applicant, they are not a lobbyist. And the legislation relates to third parties. Do groups protesting development who send representatives qualify as third parties for register purposes?
So under the Integrity Act, so Section 4 deals with lobbying, and if you have a look, the definition is fairly narrow. So if you're a lobbyist, it means that you have been engaged by a third party, usually for a profit motive, so you will receive a payment or a gift of some kind, and that's to lobby on behalf or represent the third party's interests, for example, to government or in a meeting. If you're an applicant on an application, just say a town planner, whether you're listed is largely irrelevant. It's really how you came to be there and what your relationship is to whatever it is that the application is about. So it is not uncommon for town planners to be registered as lobbyists. It's not uncommon for lawyers to be registered as lobbyists as well. So it really will turn on the facts on the particular occasion. If you've got any questions about lobbying, you're welcome to get in contact with our office. Some clear examples of things that aren't lobbying though, if you're part of an association and you go forward because of your association or your membership in that group. So a common example would be a growers group. That would not be lobbying. As well, if you're an employee, a regular employee of a company and you're meeting with government or local council, then you are not there lobbying. So it is quite a specific and fairly narrow definition.
All right, thanks Nicola. This one I assume is probably for Alan, but could be addressed by a few of you. Will there be further opportunity for councils to have an input in future Belcarra reforms?
I think so. There's always an opportunity for councillors and other interested parties to make submissions, not just through the formal process. There's always the formal process, of course, for legislative reform, which requires submissions to be addressed by the committee and to hear evidence about various submissions. But that doesn't stop you outside that process actively corresponding with the Minister, the DG, the Department, and us for that matter if you'd like our help or views on what we think might be appropriate. And frankly, I think it's a very good question because I think it's very important that you become personally involved with some of these things because they directly, as you know, affect you and very much might change your daily activities. So get involved, understand it and have your say.
As well, you can make, if there is a bill or a hearing before Parliament, you can make a submission either as an individual or the council can make a submission as well, and that's a good way to have your say.
All right, thanks Alan. And Nicola, we've got a bit of a follow-up question around our vexatious complaints. in the context of vexatious claims to media. How do councils report and manage the continuous vexatious statements and comments through the media?
Everyone stop there.
Well, I think, I mean, that comes down to something we've campaigned about, in fact had a public hearing about a few years ago, that if you are genuinely concerned, anyone is genuinely concerned about misconduct or corrupt conduct in our case, it is critically important that you come to us or the OIA or the Integrity Commissioner for advice without going public. You should do an approach confidentially, because if you go public first to the media, it becomes a media storm. The first thing that does, if there is corrupt conduct or misconduct, is to alert the suspect. They can destroy evidence, they can get their heads together, they can make our job and the job of our other integrity agencies virtually impossible. So if you are genuinely so-called concerned about corruption and misconduct, you need to report it to the relevant authorities and give us a chance to look at it. If we say there's nothing in it and you still disagree, you can go public then. But don't go public in the first instance. It disrupts and often makes impossible a successful investigation.
All right, we've got another question here from a councillor. What action should be taken if a councillor receives an abusive email which also allows other councillors to see the content of the same email?
It's an abusive email from the member of the public, I'm assuming.
I'm not clear whether I've read it as perhaps from another councillor, but it could be a member of the public, I suppose.
Okay. So I guess if you get content, whether it's by email or social media, that's abusive from members of the public in the first instance, that's unfortunately a really unattractive part of this sort of increased social media life. And I think it's a part that I really see councillors struggle with, often to the detriment of their mental health. And I would strongly encourage councillors not to engage and not to become a part of that problem. That councillors, I guess, unlike the members of the public in that situation, are subject to codes of conduct, and their higher expectations are expected of councillors by virtue of the elected positions that they have as critical leaders within local government and their communities. So if you're abused by email from a member of the public or online, please take the higher ground and don't engage. We'd encourage you to use our impressum that we've developed with the local government associations, some rules for your website that are put there up front, so that if people break those rules, then you can delete, hide or block members of the public from your website and screenshot the relevant posts that lead to that, so that there's a record of it should there be a complaint that comes down the track. So it's about balancing the need that for members of the public to be able to engage in a constructive way on matters of public interest, with the need of councillors not to be the subject of unacceptable conduct. If you receive that email and it's from another councillor, then that potentially is a breach of the code of conduct. So your way of dealing with that would be to report it. That will be assessed and, if appropriate, referred back for investigation.
Terrific. Thanks, Kath. One last question, I think, probably directed towards Alan. Alan, what do you think is the single most important thing that councils can do to mitigate against the risks of corruption?
I have a very strong view about this, and I think it fundamentally comes back to culture, workplace culture. At council you need to be alert, but to have a culture where you genuinely value reporting of misconduct, and people who report misconduct will not be harassed, bullied or denigrated or find it career threatening. They'll be lauded as having done the right thing, they'll be supported for having done the right thing, and all the appropriate procedures will be followed, and there'll be follow-up in terms of publishing the outcomes of such matters that come to light. If you have a culture where everyone from the first day employee to the boss's last day on the job who understands and values the reporting of misconduct so it can be dealt with, that's a very, very healthy workplace culture and will make it very hard for any corrupt or individuals who are minded to misbehave to gain any traction at all. If they do, they'll be outed and might understand that they're in the wrong workplace. That's what you want to achieve.
Thanks, Alan. All right, well, I think we've come to the end of our webinar today, just after 11:30. We've got one final question here which relates to, I suppose, the closing remarks in any event around access to these slides and to, I suppose, re-watching this video after this webinar is concluded. We will make copies of these slides available following the webinar. We'll get some information out about where they can be accessed through after the webinar. And you can also view a copy of this presentation on the same link that you accessed to join the webinar this morning. We'll also make copies of this presentation available from the sites of our partner agencies, from the CCC, the Integrity Commissioner and the Office of the Independent Assessor. So lots of places you can access a copy of this video after we're finished today. So I'd like to say in conclusion, thank you for joining us today. If you've got any final questions you'd like to send through, you can still do that via the link on the screen below you, and we will undertake to get back to you via email as soon as we can. We'll respond to you as soon as we can, and thanks for watching us all today. Thank you very much to our presenters who have taken the time to be here this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.